Hi, everyone. It's Pastor Warren, and it's good to be with you again. Today, we want to look at chapter 6 in Dr. J. Richards' book, Money, Greed, and God. Really important book for our times because you got people protesting in the streets with banners saying we need to destroy capitalism. You got millions of people voting for a socialist and people thinking that we need to become like socialist Europe. There's a lot of confusion today about economics, about the history of capitalism. That's why this book, I think, is such a useful one, such a valuable one for our day. Dr. J. Richards on Money, Greed, and God, why capitalism is the solution and not the problem. In the book, Dr. Richards looks at 8 myths that people believe, a lot of Christian people even, regarding capitalism. The first one we looked at was the nirvana myth, where people compare capitalism with some kind of ideal out there that doesn't even exist. The second myth was the piety myth, the idea that if you have these good intentions, you want to help the poor and all, that's all that really counts, not results, not what it really produces. The third myth was the zero-sum game myth, the idea that if some people win, then others have to lose. Then there was the materialist myth, the idea of wealth is just static, it can only change hands. If some people have it, that means they're taking it from others. Last time we looked at the greed myth, that the essence of capitalism is just greed. Today we're going to look at the 6th chapter, the 6th myth, which Dr. Richards calls the usury myth. That's the old word for interest and so forth. Usury. This is the idea that working with money is inherently immoral. The charging interest is always exploitive, ripping people off. The title of the chapter asks the question, hasn't Christianity always opposed capitalism? So Dr. Richards wants to look at that, the history of it, the development of capitalism in the church and so forth, to see if Christianity hasn't always been opposed to it. He begins the chapter talking about when he was a boy, how he collected soda bottles and cans and so forth and traded them in for money. When he got up to about $100, his dad took him out of school one day and took him to a bank to open his first bank account and teach him about banking and saving and interest and all that. And Jay says he was amazed as he learned, that his money could go into a bank account and actually accumulate wealth till he was a millionaire, or until he needed a new bike, whichever came first. And as you might guess, well, the new bike came first. But anyway, the idea of interest. We teach our kids about these things. We think it's important to teach them. But we're all accustomed to that today. We pay for stuff online with credit cards. We earn interest in bank accounts or 401ks or stocks or whatever. We pay interest. We're just used to all that. And we don't lie awake at night, worrying that we might be going to hell because of it. Well, you know what? For centuries, that situation would have been very different. Many people, if they were loaning or making interest or paying interest, they would have worried about going to hell. Why? Well, because most Christian thinkers taught that usury was sin, and people who made money with money were terrible people. In Dante's Inferno, one of the lowest levels of hell was for money changers. The reason for all of this was because, let's face it, even scriptures teach that usury is wrong. Charging interest on loans is wrong. Let me give you some examples. Dr. J. Richards mentions Exodus 22:25 says Israelites were not to loan money to their own people at interest. Leviticus 25:25 through 37 says that if an Israelite falls into difficult times, other Israelites are not to loan him money at interest. They could loan to foreigners, Leviticus 23:19 through 20, but they could never loan at interest to their brothers. You remember Psalm 15. That's where it says, who may abide on God's holy hill? Who may ascend, in other words, into the very presence of God? Well, one of the answers in that Psalm, Psalm 15, verses 1 and 5, is that he who does not loan money to his brothers at interest is one of the people who can ascend and be with God. Scriptures were against loaning money to your brothers at interest. In the New Testament, Jesus actually said in Luke 6:34-35 that we should loan money to people without expecting anything back. And Jay Richards says, hey, you know what? You wouldn't inscribe that in granite over the Bank of America, would you? We know that Jesus drove money changers out of the temple. We know that Paul said the love of money was the root of all evil. So there's a scriptural basis that makes it easy to understand why most Christian scholars in the early and the medieval period of the church spoke against and wrote against usury. And of course, the church was born in a Greco-Roman thought world, and in that world, usury was condemned. Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle condemned it. Romans like Cicero, Cato, Seneca, they all condemned it. Even Buddha condemned it. Even Muhammad condemned it. Islam today is still against it. The question is, why did all these people think this way? How did they get to this? And how did we get to where we have a different position today? Are we right in our new way of thinking about things? Are we right to not worry about going to hell because we pay interest or we charge interest? What caused all this? Dr. Richards looks at it historically. And I've mentioned in earlier teachings here and in earlier sessions how Dr. Rodney Stark, another Christian scholar, also talks about this. They both look at it in the same way. When I begin to see the same thing being said by various people in the same way, I begin to realize that something is true. So what happened was there was a development in society that caused our views to change. And it happened over a period of centuries, a couple centuries or a little more. It was the development of capitalism that actually just forced everybody in the Western world to rethink and reevaluate how we looked at money, loans, interest, banking, and all that. You see, in biblical times, and all the way up through the Middle Ages, most people were farmers. They were peasants. They lived simple agricultural lives, and the majority of them were poor, or at least on the verge of poverty. We know they had money even in ancient times. They had coins. They would mint coins with Caesar's picture on there or whatever. Jesus referred to that in the Bible. But money back then was more of a static commodity. Only a very small percentage of people had any extra money. And those who did, they stored it out. You know, you'd bury a chest full of coins out in the backyard or something, or in a cave or under the bed. Nobody used money back then to make money. In fact, making money, business, and all that was thought of as a lowly pursuit, not for the nobility, not for the better people. So when we read these scriptures about not loaning at interest and all, we have to understand them in that context. The only time money would be loaned back then would be in a time of crisis, like when the crops failed, or there's a war, or there's an illness, something of that sort. So in such a case, the person loaning the money would be a wealthy person, and the person borrowing it would be a very poor person in a desperate time of crisis. The money the rich person would loan wasn't doing anything. It was just buried in the ground or sitting in a vault or something like that. And so the idea there was, if you charge interest in a situation like that, what you're doing is gouging a brother when he's down, when he's in trouble. He's in a crisis, and you're not doing anything with your money anyway, but yet you're going to charge this guy interest to help him out. See, it was in that context that God forbade the charging of interest from fellow Israelites. The money wasn't doing anything anyway. The brother was in trouble. You're going to gouge him. That's the context. Well, what changed it was, around the 12th century, there was a greater division of labor. There was higher productivity on the farms and agriculture and so forth. All of the stuff that was going on, the trade and everything, led to an increase in wealth, an expansion of wealth. You know, we talked about earlier, a lot of people think that wealth in the world is like a pie. If you take a bigger slice, that means other people got to get smaller slices. But we saw that in the book that's just not true. The pie actually can get bigger, and everybody can have more. And that's what was happening in the 12th century. The pie was getting bigger. More and more production, more and more labor and trade and merchandise and so on. And of course, the money of the time was coins, silver and gold coinage. And as trade increased and you had to send money to another country and all like that, the coins, there began to be a shortage of coins. There began to be problems with coins. People would shave coins and then put some of that metal aside and then melt it down and make other coins. And so your coin wasn't worth as much. They began to remint coins with crummier metals in there, so they were less valuable. People would rob you. If you sent money, a shipment of money over the mountain passes, there'd be robbers there who would take it from you, and so on. So all of this situation led to the creation of banks and banking. And banks were developed to solve some of these problems. Of course, banks started in monasteries, but then there were other banks that developed in northern Italy and so forth. So there was a lot of wool trade in England and in what was called Flanders, which is today modern Belgium. And so if you tried to send money up there to buy wool and bring it back to Italy, well, you might be ripped off on the way. So what would happen is they developed a system where, like what we have today, you could deposit your silver or gold with a bank in Italy. Then that bank would send what was called a bill of exchange by a courier through the mountain passes up to Flanders to say, hey, this guy paid in our bank here. So then they had a branch, just like today, up there in Flanders. The bill of exchange would say, hey, credit this guy the money. Credit this person this amount of money they've paid for the wool. We'll give money from this bank here in Flanders to our wool merchant, and that way it doesn't have to be shipped over through the mountain passes and so forth. So then the silver and gold was held locally, and all that had to be transported was the paperwork. People that before were despised, money changers, began to be more important people, more esteemed people, because they kept the records and all the exchanges and so on. And the banking system that developed solved a lot of the problem, the dangers, the difficulties of transporting silver and gold. And it changed the whole concept of money. Instead of being a static commodity that you bury in the ground somewhere, money began to be a tool for the expansion of business and wealth. And when money was deposited in these banks, people would come to the banks and say, hey, can I borrow some? I want to invest over here. I want to start a company, a craft, a trade, whatever over there. And the bankers began to realize, hey, we could, instead of just storing this, we could loan it and we could charge money on that. They could pay us for it. They would take the money and pay us the interest, but they would make money off of the money. The banker loaning the money is taking a risk at loaning, and he doesn't have it anymore to use. So it's right for him to charge you to pay for the use of his money. And since you're going to use the money to make money, it's right for you to pay a charge to use the money. All of this brought about the changes in society. Loans became common. Even the numeric system changed from Roman numerals, which were really awkward and difficult to use, to Arabic numerals, or what you call Hindu Arabic numerals. So finance and banking and all that became more representational. Money was representational. This paper here represents money that's over there in that bank. And money had a time value now, because money could increase. It could gather interest and become more valuable over time. It was all of these developments that caused everyone, including the church, because the world had a Christian worldview then. It was strongly influenced by the church. So everyone, including the church leaders, began to change their views on all of this: banking, loaning money, interest, and all that. And it was no longer loaning money to a poor neighbor in crisis. No, it was a business tool you used to make money. So over time, theologians and scholars saw how these things had changed, saw how everything was very different, and they began to redefine their terms. Usury became just taking advantage of somebody who was in dire straits, whereas charging interest, loaning money for business, that was a totally different thing. And great reformers like John Calvin and others were quick to understand it. And they changed the church's teaching. Some people will tell you, well, they just did it because they were making money and they wanted to cover their greediness or justify their greediness. It's just not really true. They did it not to justify their greediness. They did it because the whole system had changed and they needed to change with it. In spite of all this, even today, there are Christians who still have very negative thoughts about bankers, capitalism, banking, and all that. Jay Richards in the book cites one Christian feminist website. I put that in quotation marks. Christian feminist to me is an oxymoron. But anyway, he cites a website where they say, Jesus, what would Jesus do and what would Jesus never do? Well, Jesus would never, they say, be a Wall Street trader or a banker for a large national or international banking conglomerate. He would never participate in the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. And of course, Richards asks, and I ask, really? Like, who says? Where did you get these ideas? Who says working with money is inherently more evil than any other profession? These people make this up. There's no real reason to believe it. There's no stats. There's no basis for their belief. They just make it up. So here's the main point. It's the main point of chapter 6. Many people think Christianity was always opposed to capitalism and fought against its development. And so they use that as a justification for being opposed to it today. But it's just not true. The truth is, for 1,000 years, everybody was opposed to charging interest on money. Everybody thought it was immoral. What's different about the Christian West is that it was able to recognize the changes in how money was handled and adapt to them. Christianity redefined its views on all these things. A lot of other societies didn't. The Islamic society did not. And so a growing number of scholars today have come to the realization that capitalism isn't something the Christian church fought against. No, capitalism only developed in the Christian West. It didn't develop anywhere else in the world. And rather than being opposed to it, Christianity contributed to its development and adapted to the new situation. I don't know why this thing's freezing up. All right. Now, what about the scriptures we looked at the beginning? All those in Leviticus and everything in the scriptures with Jesus and Paul. If you look at each one of them closely in the light of what we've been talking about here, it becomes very clear that the Bible isn't condemning banks and loans and interest the way we understand these things today. It was talking about a different context. The Bible was condemning greediness, hard-heartedness, materialism. Jesus was condemning turning ministry into a way of making money. That's why he drove out the money changers. To equate that with being against modern day interest and loans and all that is just off base. So Jay Richards ends the chapter with this quote: "We must distinguish what the Bible actually says from what we assume it ought to say. Unfortunately, as we've seen, when it comes to economics, pious assumptions too often replace careful thinking and careful reading," unquote. That's just very true, isn't it? We need careful thinking, careful reading. We need to analyze things in the proper context. And that's why I have thought it so important to share this great book with you to help us to get clearer thinking regarding economics in general and capitalism and so on. Next week or next time, we'll look at the seventh myth, the seventh chapter of the book, which Jay Richards calls the artsy myth, which is confusing aesthetic judgments with economic arguments. The chapter's title is, "Doesn't Capitalism Lead to an Ugly Consumerist Culture?" I think you and I both know that a lot of people think it does, but a lot of people are wrong. So I hope you'll tune in next week for that discussion. Until then, may the Lord richly bless you.